I wanted to hear the story about your factory work because this might be relevant.
Oh yeah. So I was working at this factory, right? And it was an industry where there's a huge on season and off season. So there's a small like skeleton crew of year round workers, and then there are the temp workers, right? And I got this job because I was, to use an economic term, desperate. And I just took a job, right? I was like, okay, they pay X and X dollars an hour. It's not too bad. But what I didn't realize is I wasn't an employee. I was a contractor. And so what that means is that I didn't get paid overtime. So I was working 60 hours a week, no overtime. I didn't get benefits, and I to use I basically contractors get taxed at a significantly higher rate than normal workers do in the U.S. It
Yeah.
sucks. And so the people who did that were a motley crew, to put it mildly. I was very much out of place as someone with a college degree. And so I was just there to get along, right? I didn't say anything. I just put my head down and worked. But I overheard some of the most wild conversations. And so like this factory, right, it was kind of multi levels. And there's kind of scaffolding, around level 2 and then another floor at level 3, right? So kind of like a half floor in between, if you can imagine. So I'm like walking between these two floors, and I hear these two women talking, and these women are relatively old, like, probably in their, late 50s to early 60s. And the context that I picked up from this conversation is one of them is a long timer. The other woman used to work at the factory, left for a while, and is now back, right? So that's the background. And so these two women are talking back and forth. She's like, oh, like, why do you come back? And the other one's like, yeah, I liked my job. I had great benefits, but yeah, they let me go for stupid reason. And the other one's like, oh, what'd they let you go for? She's like, well, I just lost my temper and, pushed my boss down the stairs and she broke her legs. Just like flat like that. And the other one was like, yeah, I mean, pretty much. I mean, she shouldn't have pushed you. Metaphorically.
You hear stories like that all the time in jobs like that, because I worked in construction, and Judas has worked before he worked as what do we call you, like what's above a landlord? Like a boss, but like a landlord boss. You're kind of like a landlord type guy, right?
Yeah, because I
land
never own
duke,
property,
if you will.
Yeah.
I'm always trying to find ways to call him a landlord, because this is a landlord respecting show.
Oh yeah, of course. But, I mean, like, if you can't get off on evicting a single mother in the dead of winter, like, what kind of man are you?
It's the only job where you're allowed to abuse women, frankly, actually. But you'll hear the crazy stories when I used to work construction of people just like that getting fired for something hilarious because in a white collar situation, going postal is a big deal. It doesn't really happen much anymore. In blue collar trades, people go postal every day in a variety of different ways. There's always like you threw a hammer at a bitch's foot, or like you blew up at your boss and like crashed your car into his wife's ass, something like that, And that happens a lot, and I love it. Salt of the earth people, I miss that. I work in an office, and now I can only pray someone drives a car into someone, but it never comes.
Yeah.
Well, you realize that, like, and I think that it comes from being raised in a very like middle class environment, is that you have this mentality, and it's not even like explicitly said, where it's like if you mess up one thing, if you say one wrong word, you're done. Like you're a street urchin, and you kind of like take a step back and you're like, oh, wait a minute, like the guy who fixes my plumbing says the N-word at work, and no one cares. And it's like, okay, maybe there's some other alternatives.
They say the N-word to the black guys who are there.
Yeah, exactly. In front of HR.
Yeah.
Who's also black. And then it's like,
yeah, exactly.
HR, they shoot paintballs at him. Like, I still think to this day, I haven't worked on like a job site in quite some time. I still think about some of the conversations that I heard there. And there's just they're so funny. And there's this one guy, and we were building like a warehouse, just a big warehouse, which is kind of a thing you don't imagine building. They just pop up out of the ground one day. We were building a giant warehouse, and then he was just this black guy, older black guy, and he was just like holding court because every situation is like one guy holding court with like a bunch of other guys, and he was just explaining how he was like annoyed with his wife for wanting to have sex with him. Like he's just like Al Bundy situation, right? Getting home and he's like, look, I'm tired. I want to have a beer. Look, if you want to give me a blowjob, fine, but I'm not going to fuck you. And I remember being 20, like in my early 20s. I'm like, whoa, he doesn't want to have sex with someone, because that's all you fucking want to do. And I'm like, that guy is a legend. I hear you.
The high virile construction worker, like 10 years of semen retention, right?
Yeah. Or he's like, I could have sex. I'm not going to because I shouldn't have to. Like he's got a whole an ideology behind it. I'm like that. I think about that conversation like once a month. I don't know what it is about it. I just love that shit. Anyway, so I better introduce you. We've been going off for a while.
Oh yeah.
We're having a grand old time before we hit record. I am here with someone who I've spoken to before. I had a great time speaking to him previously. This is Jay Burden. And Jay Burden is the host of the Jay Burden Show, which is a fantastic interview show. You can hear him interview some fascinating people. You'll have a great time doing it. You could also find him on Twitter @_Jay Burden. And the podcast is also on Substack. You can find it there. So if you're on Substack, look that up. Jay, it's great to talk to you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I was just talking to my wife about this. I think that the interview I did with you guys is probably the funniest single episode of my show because I was living with my roommate at the time, and I'm sure you guys remember my roommate accidentally kicked the router over. Yes. So I lost internet like right towards the end. And so the last, I think it's like 6 to 8 minutes of the show, I'm just gone. And so it's basically
podcast.
Yeah, exactly. It's an episode of Blood Satellite, like kind of a bonus at the end. And so I don't know. I thought that was kind of funny.
That's right. Yeah, I remember Judas was there. And for people who are listening, and you should be listening, Judas is here in the real life.
I am.
And I don't, because people are thinking, why isn't Judas ever on these things? And he crowbarred his way into this one.
I found him. I found where they were recording. I picked the lock, so here I am.
Well, see, I'm actually kind of mad, Dimes, because I specifically asked for Judas not to be here. I resent him deeply and personally.
Look, he's laughing. He's like, you know what he did. This is fun. It's going to change. It's a good dynamic. I always enjoy talking with Judas. I don't know if I would know how to do it without Judas here. And I kind of sprung it on Judas. I'm like, hey, you get in on this. So if this is a total disaster, one could surmise that it is because Judas is here.
Uh-huh. Or, I mean, if it's a success and it's the best episode we've ever done, I would like to also take a little bit of credit for that, too.
See, this is why I hate having him here, because when I talk about him, now he is also here to be like, actually, if he wasn't here, think of all the stuff that this would have gone so much smoother if I just said a thing about him. And we just let it sit there and grow into a wise oak.
That brings up the important question, which is, Judas, do you listen to the show, if you're not on a segment?
Yeah. Well, I mean, because they're all appended to the end of the interview, so I do. And what was the last one that you did? And I feel like a dick because I can't remember the fellow's name.
There's the Black Horse.
Black Horse. It was Black Horse. That was really good. I love these. So, I mean, and I don't know. I don't read as much as Dimes does. So, I mean, I don't think I'm super useful in a lot of these. But no, I love our show. So.
Well, I know you might be more useful than me on this episode. And before we get into the topic, I had to just mention how close to failure we are now, because I kind of just want to talk about Lauren Southern's divorce.
I got an earful from my wife in the car. We were in the Home Depot, and we come back out, and like the whole drive, we're talking about fucking Lauren Southern. So
okay, just before we go, Jay, take a seat for a second. What is Judas' wife saying about this? I need to get this.
Oh, Judas' wife. What are you saying about Lauren Southern? Just she's a dumb whore, and she should. It's the whole thing. You know what it was? We're joking about the VTuber, or not VTuber, like a YouTube vlogger thing where they're like, oh, I had to record this 8 times. You guys don't understand. Every time I tried to record it, I started to cry, and I needed to try again. And but I think the last 2 videos she's done, it's been this dramatic bullshit. Like, bitch, you're not relevant anymore.
It's funny. Cares. Like I record this 8 times. It's like, no, if it starts going bad, stop and then restart again. You don't need to record the whole fucking thing.
Yeah, maybe you're just bad at producing videos. I don't know. Maybe it's that too.
There's this thing called editing So you could like cut out the part where you're crying. You don't got to redo the whole fucking thing unless you're lying. Unless you're a lying person.
Or unless you're going to release an unedited full cut with all of them as like bonus material for New Year's Eve or something.
We're
That'd be
literally
cool,
doing
too.
the thing that I'm not supposed to do because we got a good guest here.
Okay, sorry.
But I was going to
I'll
say,
put it this way: as the classic child of divorce, I would really appreciate it if my parents had put together a director's cut. You know, it would make the whole thing a lot clearer.
honestly, that's actually a very poignant point. Like, can you imagine? This is a generation that is witnessing parent because these aren't celebrities. Let's start with that. Let's start with these people are kind of influencers. So if you were like a Shelley Duvall, I'm just saying that because I read about her before the show. I'm like, yeah, you're a celebrity, so you read about your parents' divorce in the press. But now this isn't like journalists hounding you. You're releasing not just a press release, but like a director's cut tearful press release, an ugly press release on your divorce, and that's something kids are going to have to live with. I don't know what it's like to be a kid who's got to look back on this. Like my mom, for no reason, told the world about the divorce and got into like weird, scummy details about the minutia of the argument. You know what I mean? Anyway, that just.
Well, I feel like the ultimate example of that is right. It's like the OnlyFans girls. You know, where it's like.
You know, what happened to that one? You know, the one that was the most famous, the one who did the cross-eyed, you know,
Belle Delphine.
Belle Delphine. What happened to Belle Delphine? And I mean that on like I don't. That's not rhetorical.
The short story I heard is she went from the blogger, whatever gamer girl, to OnlyFans to like rape porn and then to like blacked porn, and now she's all used up like an old tissue and nobody cares. That's what I heard.
You know what sucks? Just as a Catholic, I know where she ends up. She ends up as a recent Catholic convert, and I gotta be like, yeah, you're saved now. Oh yeah, you're saved. I'll real quick too. Thank you. Okay, yeah, you're just like Mary.
Yeah.
People are mad at you. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I cut you off there, Jay.
No. I was just gonna say, as a narrowly defined financial expert, I can tell you that. Despite what the internet will tell you, becoming an e-prostitute is not a surefire ticket to long-lasting familial wealth. The math doesn't add up.
No kidding.
We are going to be dealing, and I guess this will be good to segue into the actual meat of our discussion. That's a very good point in that we've heard murmurs about this from various women that it's only like the 1% of the top 1% that make any significant money. Everyone else is being... Like they would make more money being a streetwalker. Like they might as well just be like a cam girl from the 90s would have made more money than what some of these OnlyFans girls are making. And I feel like coming down the pike, this is going to be men's problem eventually. It's going to be everyone else's problem that it'll be a social phenomenon. Remember those 10 years where every woman became a prostitute? That's COVID. This is horror COVID we're dealing with right now, and everyone's going to say, "Woof, that was kind of crazy," and then we all are expected to go back to normal. I don't know if I have a question in there, but I'm just wondering, like, what do you think about the OnlyFans phenomena for? I guess it's uniquely young women, and I'm not sure. I don't know if gay men are on OnlyFans. I assume they are, but it seems to be mainly women, right?
Well, I think that it's like the truly like toxic marriage between like feminism and capitalism, right? And look, like I'm no commie. That's not my point, but it is sort of this like horrible mix between like, you know, the only thing that is right is your autonomy, right? Like you rule over yourself, and also like you are an empowered and high status person because you can command attention with your body, and you should use that to like get yourself social advancement. You know, so it's kind of this like horrible trap, right? Where essentially you're taking someone whose brain is not fully developed, right? Like you are technically an adult. You were at your kind of like apex of attraction and like one of the lowest points of your like common sense, and basically said like, hey, if you like make a deal with the devil, there's a chance you could be a millionaire. Just roll the dice, you know? And it's like, it's sort of like the inverse of the like, you see the same thing. People are, and oftentimes, you know, the same people who are very pro OnlyFans will say like, oh, like it's so wrong that you can send like a military recruiter to a high school, or like, student loans that you can give a massive loan, out to, a 17 or 18-year-old kid. Like, that's awful. But when it's like, oh, hey, like, a recent high school graduate, like, can you start an OnlyFans and like ruin your entire life for a minuscule chance at like fleeting wealth? Well, of course, right? That's a good and, a freeing thing to do. And obviously, like, there's a moral dimension as well as an economic one, but it is essentially, like, you're right, it's going to create an epidemic of essentially like failed prostitutes, right?
And I wonder, and I suppose this is where we'll get into the main point here. So your background, and I don't expect you to dox yourself in any significant way, but your area of expertise would it be fair to say finance, personal finance?
Yeah. So the way that I think I described it to you is that Black Horse and I are in the same segment of the economy, right? But Black Horse is probably something similar to like, or most similar to like like an architect or like an urban planner, right? Like very, very high level. Whereas, like my limited field of expertise is like more someone like, the guy who like pours the concrete, right? It's like very nitty gritty details. Like if you need a specific problem solved, I can probably at least point you in the right direction. But if you're like, hey, why is the interest rate on my house 7%? It's like, I mean, I can kind of tell you, but to be honest, like that's not my job. Get mad at someone else is the best way I describe it.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we spend all our days arguing about. Go on Twitter right now, go on Telegram, go wherever, and we're still debating about the very highest reaches of the decision making of these things. But I think it's probably more relevant and relatable to the average person, the average listener, to know, like, okay, here's the scenario. And we talked about this before the show. About a lot of people are probably thinking there are various degrees of the West has fallen. We're all on the West has fallen spectrum. It's just whether or not you think it's going to end in 100 years or in 5 years, right? But there's a lot of negativity. There's a lot of people thinking we're on the down tilt of something. And I think you had a very interesting perspective, which was, what can we say to the individual who would hold these beliefs? What can they do in the next 5 years, 10 years, 25 years? And this is why I think it's especially relevant to Judas and myself, is because we talk about this all the time on the show. We talk about very practical responses to living in a society. In our case, Canada. I believe Jay is in the United States, but in our case, it's like, okay, what do you actually do with your money? Should you have savings? Should you not have savings? Should you be investing? Where is crypto land and all that? So, if you wanted to kind of give a bird's eye view of your take on all that, go ahead.
So a big part of this, right, is that I can't obviously give anyone specifics. I don't know your situation. So if you have, XYZ number of like specific requirements, that's going to change things. But I would say that the biggest kind of decision point is kind of like what do you believe is kind of like the purpose of money? Because there's some people who kind of view it as an end in and of itself, right? Where it's like, yes, my bank account has reached whatever n+1, I am now a success. I think that I'd hope, right, that most people in these circles don't tend to lean towards that. I view that as, kind of like materialistic. But if you view money as a tool, right, you can use it to essentially achieve your ends. The question becomes like, all right, then, what are your ends? And to me, right, obviously, like money is a way to kind of like buffer you and yours from, let's just say, like the negative side effects of, shall we say, like societal transformation. That's one. The other one is to basically like say like, all right, like if we in this, this bizarre little corner of the internet have kind of, realized that, societies and cultures are moved through kind of like organized elites. Well, to be honest, right, like elites aren't born, they're kind of made. When you look at someone like Alexander, when you look at someone like Napoleon, they certainly had unusual talents, right? I'm not going to deny that. These were great men. But, they weren't peasants. They weren't dirt farmers. And so if you view yourself as like, all right, like you're right, like we're all in kind of the West has fallen camp. And I think if we're kind of brutally honest with ourselves, we all kind of look at us and we're like, okay, me, Jay Burden, you, Dimes or Judas, we're probably not Caesar. That guy isn't us. But, Caesar could be a burden, or Caesar could be a Judas, your descendant, right? And so if you're looking towards that of trying to like, okay, like how do we take these values and project them into the future? There's a part of that which is like you kind of have to build. And when I think of that, right, one of the things that it goes back to is like one of the old sawhorses, like one of the things that's just a common refrain in these circles is, the boomers failed us, right? They didn't continue with that kind of like chain of societal obligation. And so obviously like complaining about that is fun and it's useful to a certain point. But, at a certain junction, it's like, okay, guys, like, what are you going to do about it? And so like,
and just want to say that's something we've said on the show quite a few times, that I'm not a fan of this intergenerational war that seems localized primarily on the West. I can't really speak to if it's happening in Japan or the Middle East or anything, the South America, but it seems that the sharp demarcation between like boomers and Gen X and millennials, as if they're different species, seems unique to us. And it seems that we spend an inordinate amount of time trying to hold boomers accountable and almost fantasize about their demise, which seems counterproductive to me.
Definitely. And I would, that's probably a whole nother conversation in itself, right? But assuming that we accept the premise that the torch has been dropped, right? That the kind of like healthy institutions and the healthy economy that we would hope for is not there. It's kind of like, all right, well, like what can you do about it? And from my perspective, right, like developing kind of like wealth and resiliency and the ability to kind of like guard your family, your community from kind of the negative effects of the regime is, let's be honest, that's an expensive process, right? Lawyers take money. Sending your kid to private school takes money. And so like at the top order of that is just like, how do you get money in the door? Like that's not an easy thing, right? Like I'm not going to say I'm an incredibly wealthy man working on it, right? So that's a part where it's like, I mean, I can offer you general advice, right? Like I'm kind of the opinion that like, yeah, university sucks. And like, they're going to try and make you into a gay communist, but like, there's a certain point where it's like, okay, how else are you going to make, 6 figures? Like, yeah, sure. You can get an awesome based trade job, but one, there aren't that many of those really. And two, like not everyone can do them. That's why they cost money, or that's why they pay so much, excuse me. And so like, there's a certain point where it's like, and this is a question that I would kind of ask the hypothetical listener, which is like, how much are you willing to like integrate with the system? Like how much are you willing to kind of like bend the knee? Because we all kind of have to do it a little bit, right? Like Judas times, I'm sure that both of you guys have kind of had those moments where you're like, oh, I'm just going to shut up, because I don't want to lose my job.
Well, literally, I can't speak for Judas. And Judas, if you want to give an example after, but I know that I've worked with clients that have been diametrically opposed to not only my beliefs but also my well-being. By which I mean I've worked. My wife has worked as well with nonprofit clients that are working in sort of an anti-extremist space, and one of their, they'll go after Muslim extremists and whatnot, but they're very, very concerned about what they would call far right extremists. And who are far right extremists? Well, they would count like Trump voters in that. So like I've been in meetings, I've been in calls with these types of people. So I have, on one hand, I have a unique insight into how they actually work and how they talk and how lost in the weeds they are with what they're doing. Like these are the people who think like the number one threat in America is the KKK. And the KKK doesn't functionally exist anymore. So they're like, I'm not worried about them, but I've been like, you need this money. And this is something I've always gone back and forth about with people. It's like how pure do you intend to be while intending to survive? And Judas, let me know what you think about this, because I think you might agree with me, but I'm not sure. That to me, survival is the number one thing. And having principles and ideologies, I think you need those to ground you. But like, if you are putting yourself in a position where you disproportionately suffer for principle, like I don't know if that really benefits anyone. I don't know if I'm saying that in the wrong way.
You know what it is? It's like one way of looking at it is like the paradox of tolerance. Like the extremely tolerant can't exist for long because they tolerate the intolerant and then are destroyed. So it just can't happen. And another example, because I was thinking about this exact thing earlier, because we were actually having a conversation about this kind of economic principle thing in the chat just a few hours ago. But the idea of when you're on a plane and they tell you that when there's an accident in the plane and you have a small child, you put the mask on yourself first, and you'd think, no, I want to save my child. But it's like, if you save your child and then you die, your child dies anyways. And I think it's the same thing about like having strong principles, whether they're religious or political or philosophical. Like your principles, either through belief or through acts in the world, are transmitted through you as a person. So the first thing is you need to eat and you need to live. If you don't live, your principles don't mean anything because you're dead. Especially if your principles are rare, like in our case. So yeah, I mean, and my example was that at the peak of COVID, our biggest client was like a radical Chabad in Hong Kong because they're the only people paying. Because go figure, the radical Jews have all of the money while everybody else is dying, but they were paying. And one of my biggest clients, and I was essentially sucking dick and bending the knee for these fucking like Orthodox Jews. Because I mean, it was that or shut the company down. I ultimately had to shut the company down, but if it weren't for that job, it would have actually come sooner. So you
Yeah.
have sometimes you have to do it. So
It's something like when it comes down to survival, when it comes down to, and I guess the point I was building to was that, especially if you're in the West, and you're raised in the society, you get this sense, and this was probably not where Jay wanted to go with this, but you get this sense that sacrificing yourself for an ideal is the highest form of virtue. And, the more you suffer for your virtue, to die for what you believe in is the most noble thing you can do. And I think that has many people running towards what might effectively be suicide. Like you're choosing sacrifice where maybe you don't need to choose sacrifice, and maybe you should choose survival with a slight tweak of your principles, which you should never break. Anyway, there's probably a lot of people who are pissed off at what we're saying. I don't know if I'm expressing myself
Well,
correctly.
I think that there's kind of a deeper, like even more like honorable position in this, which is essentially that like you can you can basically, by kind of taking it on the chin, you can kind of like buy out you and yours from having to suffer through that again. Like you could be like, all right, like I'll take my licks now. So the example that I always think about is like private school, right? So like I was, genuinely lucky that I was able to go to a private Christian school. It's where I, met, other, dissident right personality, George Bagby. And I was able to do that, right? Because essentially like my dad worked a corporate job, and so it's like, okay, like you can kind of use that as a way to kind of like buy more independence from the system, right? And so like I will say the other problem with this is that there's kind of a wide variety of opinions on like what is the timeline of demise, right? And I even think about this myself because like obviously if you are convinced, that the US dollar is going to be worthless tomorrow, you're not going to have 10 grand sitting in cash, right? That's stupid.
yeah, of course.
Likewise, people have very legitimate fears and concerns about the like broader market, right? The entire stock market. And to be honest, right, like over a long enough time scale, I probably share that. Like this does sort of seem to be a shell game. And it's like, well, how many times can you pass the shells around, before it's clear that there's no P, right? That it's just, we're passing fake numbers around. So I get that. But it's sort of like, over what time frame? Like if there's this idea, right, of things being Lindy. And basically the idea is that if something's been going on for a long time, it's more likely to keep going. And I think that this idea is at the core of kind of an interesting like disagreement, which is basically like, how long can they keep this up for? And I mean they and this in the most broad sense possible, right? Where it's like, obviously, the replacement migration is not good. Obviously, like turning every strata of society against each other is not good. But I think that there's this, there's faulty mentality, and it's very easy to see in like the libertarian gold bug sphere, right? People who are always going on and on about like, oh, the economy is going to fall out. It's going to be back to Mad Max tomorrow. And it's like, okay, like 2 or 3 times you've been through the cycle, like by this point I have, it's like, okay, like you guys may be right, but like if you're right the fifth time, you're still only right 20% of the time.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it is an uncomfortable situation where you're like, okay, like you kind of have to, at least part of your mind, bank on the fact that they might be able to pull this one out for way longer than we think they can.
Yeah,
And so like
at the very least, so that certain people can survive. I've posed this question on, I think, an article in the Vanguardist Journal a while ago, just as a hypothetical for people, because we seem to spend a lot of time fantasizing about society collapsing, which is like the dissident rights version of the Reddit zombie apocalypse. There's functionally no difference between us like getting together and like, oh, what are you gonna do? What are you? Except it's way more horrible, but we like that for some reason. But I said, like, consider this: what if America never falls apart? Just like entertain that idea for because you've never entertained that idea. You've never entertained the idea that maybe America doesn't just get destroyed in 5 years. Maybe call it limps along, but let's say it's so fucking powerful and such a dominant trade force that there's still a Washington D.C. in 300 years, and you don't get that sudden collapse that you've been taught to by Roland Emmerich movies. What do you do then? And no one's ever thought about that before. And is there something something workable within that?
Well, right, and so that brings us back to kind of the more specific strategies of like, what do you do? So like, friend of mine, Charlemagne, has made it pretty clear that he's essentially fully disconnected from the system. He's living out somewhere.
Yeah, he lives in that like he's building a house, I believe, of some kind, in an area, right? Or am I wrong about that?
Right. And even, people like, the Woodlander, who both of us have interviewed, have basically made it very clear that they have fully disconnected. So that's one side. The other side is basically like, fully buying in, like the American empire will reign for 1,000 years. And I think most of us kind of fall in between, which brings us to kind of like, all right, like you kind of have to pick your own risk tolerance. I can't tell you what that is. But that brings us to like, what are the generally, kind of the best ways to like ensure that your family's wealth kind of progresses over time? So there's kind of good and bad ways to go about this. And one of them, things that you kind of have to, understand, is that essentially the broader system and kind of this like god awful fusion of like pharma, finance, and government, right, is basically designed for you to like incur a large amount of money. That money will be used to essentially turn corporations into like the zombie soldiers of the state. You'll retire on that, and then that money will all go into the medical system. That is basically the design. So for instance, like I'm sure you guys have noticed, and this is, more a problem in the States maybe than it is in Canada, right? But like the last years of your life are horrendously expensive. Like most people effectively die as paupers, right? And part of that is, okay, maybe they didn't save enough, maybe the way we settle retirement isn't necessarily the best. But another part of it is just like, if you want everything, as an old person, you are going to die poor. And that's kind of uncomfortable, right?
And also, if I can give one anecdote from that's pulled from our chat, there was a man who we all love named Fortisax, and he was referring to an anecdote where he was speaking to his, I hope he's okay with me telling this, but he was speaking to his mother, and he's got I think a girlfriend or a wife of some kind, and he was off. Geez, I have the right person, right? Am I thinking?
I don't remember the story.
Okay, it's someone. Someone said a thing at one point, but he said he offered his mother the opportunity, like, "Oh, why don't you come live with me and my girl once you retire? Come stay with us, and you can for free, rent free."
I don't think it was 40.
Okay, it's fucking somebody.
It was somebody.
I think it was him though, but it doesn't matter. But he said, you hypothetically, you could do the dishes, take care of the kids, and his or instead of having to live in a retirement community. You won't need to go that route. You can stay with us, which is what you would think they want. She said, no, I don't want to do dishes or take care of kids anymore. I would rather live alone in a retirement community. And, it's so interesting, Jay, that you're saying that, because I think you are correct. But there's so many individuals who I don't think are prepared for that. Like I think they think they're gonna, like, again, that's one permanent vacation when they retire, and you know these people aren't rich, right?
Well, right. And so that was actually brings me to the broader point that I wanted to make, which is essentially that you can't have it all. This is kind of a principle in economics. And what that means is if you want to both, leave wealth, build wealth for your family as someone who isn't, shall we say, like of the top, half of 1%, right? If you're that rich, stop listening. This is not applied to you, right? But essentially, you are going to have to make some relatively uncomfortable sacrifices. And a big part of that is, right, like that example is kind of the perfect like crystallization, where it's like, if you do the kind of like generally accepted thing, right, which is like you retire at 65, you have your 401k, you have a lot of, equity up in your home, and you buy an RV, and you spend half the year in Florida. Like that is a culturally accepted thing to do, right? That's normal. But you are essentially taking anything you could pass on and burning it, right? And it's this attitude, right, that's your right. That's what you should do. And I guess my point is just that the kind of well-trod path, and this applies to a multitude of things, that is not a neutral option, right? That is just as destructive of kind of like long-term family as community as the well-trod path is when we just use an example of like the sexual marketplace, right? That it is just as kind of like corrupted and just as short-sighted, right? And so basically, right, you bring up that good example of like, all right, like making, essentially turning your family into an intergenerational one, like living near your family, living with your family. Actually, I'm currently in a situation, right, where I'm living in a property owned by a family member. Okay, it's not like the coolest thing to do, it's not the most high status thing to do, but it's a really good way, when someone isn't bringing home a lot of money, to one, keep it in the family, right? Because I'm paying rent to a family member. It stays in the clan, so to speak. But also, right, like that enables you to not have all of your kind of like economic input, essentially like squirreled away by strangers. And so kind of doing things, and this is actually maybe a good way to describe it, is that doing things that are traditionally seen as low status, but are kind of ways to ensure that you are providing for something bigger and like more long lasting than just like your own personal enjoyment, if that makes sense.
No, and that speaks to a bunch of real conversations that I've had with my wife, and Judas, I'm sure you've had with
Mhm.
Judas' wife, where, and we've spoken about this on the show. I think one of my favorite clips was called, I think it was Archie Bunker's Chair of Will and Representation. Because we
Yeah.
talk about Schopenhauer's will and representation, and then also this problem at the start, which was me and my wife were speaking practically about starting a multi-generational sort of living situation where, a lot of our family's retired, grandparents of course are retired, my mother's retired, and they've mentioned, it's like, oh, maybe we could all get a compound together, which is a weird thing for them to say. But then I'm like, okay, let's actually scheme this out. What would it be like? So, like, most of them aren't rich people, but I'd be like, you know what? The only way this works is if myself and my wife and our family is at the nucleus of this thing, and everyone else is orbiting around it. And this will become absolutely necessary as their health begins to decline.
And
But
just to interrupt you, so people understand the context. Like, it's not because you're just a greedy asshole. It's because across those two rather large families, you and your wife are the only ones who actually have decent paying jobs and have their lives together and have kids. Like, you're the only ones that actually have a model of a family to work from in the first
and
place.
also the only ones who are willing to sit down and actually plan this out, because they
Yeah.
they live their whole lives, like they're all renting in apartments now because they chose not to do this. All of these motherfuckers could have done this. My grandmother sold her house. Everyone sold their fucking property. So here we are. Everyone's renting and everyone's sad. And now they're talking like this be the fucking Brady Bunch, which is a real situation a lot of people are going to get into. But that puts us in the unique position where now we need to financially map this out, because it was never taught to us. And this is kind of what I'm getting around to Jay's point, which is that you're having to learn a whole new budgetary system because your grandparents never approached something like this. Your parents never learned this. You're like, okay, how do I fucking do this thing that we might have done for generations? You have to be the first ones to get the property that you pass down. You need to be the first ones to get all of this going. And then
Well,
not only that, you need to reestablish the familial relationships because they don't know how to be a family in this situation. The grandparents don't know how to kind of defer on certain things. Maybe they think that they're in charge. Maybe your father-in-law doesn't know how to have this new relationship, and it's conflict. So you have to like establish that hierarchy as well. And this is a real thing in this one instance, but a real thing that a young person has to think about practically. That was a bit of a long rant, but yeah.
So, and going back to, it's interesting you brought up, grandparents who sold the house. The classic example, right, is selling the farm. And that's a great example, right, of essentially taking what is a long-term familial asset, right, and essentially burning it, turning it into like liquid cash and just squandering it. And it's interesting because I live in a more rural area, I work occasionally, on a big farm, and I quite enjoy it. And it's a family affair, right? And what's interesting is the farm has grown over time because essentially all of the farmers around them, whoever it was it grandpa or the great uncle who actually worked on it, died, and all of his family members who were technically economically invested, right? Like they had a right to it, had no care for it past its like liquid value, and so again, that speaks to kind of building those, longer, like more real connections, right? Where again, like you have to kind of not only reformat your own personal priorities, which is like, okay, like this money that I am currently holding on to, it's not just mine. Like I am a custodian of this, for a little bit of time, but it's not just mine to waste. That, kind of the traditional paths to, long-term wealth, which let's be honest is hard assets like land, right? You're the landed gentry. Well, again, that's another thing where you kind of have to resist, the easy path, right? Which is to become essentially the prodigal son. And it's so interesting, that story is often kind of touted for its kind of like spiritual meaning, which certainly, right, is deep. Like we were all, to one degree or another, the prodigal son. But there's another very like real part, which is like, don't be the idiot, who takes your your family's birthright, right, and essentially spends it on blackjack and hookers.
That used to be a story we would tell. We don't even tell that story anymore because
true,
that's just people's parents that do that.
Exactly. But now it's the prodigal grandparents, and you're like, wow, thanks, Grandpa. I'm glad you had fun with your 5 sequential Harleys, but
oh no, he bought at the peak and sold on the dip. He got into crypto.
I bought a Bitcoin for $60,000.
That's a good bit. That's a good.
Like, I actually know a boomer who did that. I'm close to, but yeah,
I bet there's so many.
Close to home.
I bet all those times people were watching it go to the moon, it was because boomers were getting into it at the wrong time.
Yeah, they did a spot on Fox Business, and they're like, "Oh, what's this?"
The best thing they did was make the Bitcoin look like gold.
So this is another one, which is the classic example from The Big Short, right? Is that the main character is like, oh, I knew that the home market was done when I heard strippers talking about flipping homes. I knew crypto was going to go down when at my like the ghetto gas station that I buy coffee at next to my work, when they installed a crypto ATM there, I was like, yep, it's done. Wrap it up, boys. It's all over.
Crypto ATM also has bars over it. Like, oh no,
exactly.
People who thought there was crypto in it. No, but it's funny that you mentioned this. That I'm sorry if I'm laying too many anecdotes on you, but
oh, not at all.
This really speaks to my lived experience because my wife grew up poor, and myself and Judas did not grow up wealthy in any sense of the word, but I think we had a poor person's understanding of money. My parents had a poor person's understanding of money, and so did my wife's. So they thought of money as something you hoard. It's something you get from work and you put it in a box for later. And it just kind of, and if you do it right, maybe it accumulates a little bit of money. And the worst thing ever was to be in debt. Debt should be avoided. But they had a poverty-stricken person's idea of what debt is. Debt to them is when you borrow money to buy a thing you want. Debt wasn't something you borrow to invest to make more money. The idea of having money that makes more money was alien to them or suspicious to them. And as I've been with her for, like, Christ, I should know how long I've been with her. Let's say 13 years. Um, let's round, and say, and so she's come around to that, and I've come around to that as well, where it's like we need to think intelligently about money, and debt is something you actually need if you want to make more. But anyway, the idea of breaking out of, maybe it's mean to say this, but like a poor person's understanding of money as something, it must be transactional. You need to rejigger what those types of transactions are rather than something that you hoard. And that's back to the Fox News thing of people buying gold, but they're thinking, oh, I'm going to buy this and put it in a box and then I'll break it out of the box when I need it, which I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's really the wrong way to look at even wealth in a sense.
So it's kind of, and I'll put it this way: I might have a minority opinion on debt, right? Which is the classic answer is that there's good debt and bad debt, right? So I will also say, and maybe this is an arrogant way to look at it, I think that, to be honest, most people aren't smart enough to have debt. Is that it's actually kind of similar to a point that it wasn't Steve Saylor. Who's the guy who wrote the bell curve?
It's not Charles Murray.
Charles Murray, yes, where he makes, where essentially he's kind of lamenting the fact that the world has become more IQ dependent, right? That essentially, if you're going to make it, quote unquote, you have to have 110 or 120 IQ. To be honest, I kind of view debt the same way, and it's part of the reason that I think Dave Ramsey's an absolute psychopath. I wouldn't want to work for him. And he's kind of wrong about, like, in a very technical sense, about most of what he says. But it's sort of the example, right? Where it's like, okay, you know what? When you're telling your kid, about, like, I don't know, we'll just use the Bible as an example, right? You give them a storybook Bible. Is that the literal, like, most accurate description of what's happening? Like, is that like the Council of Trent? Some kind of, like, very in-depth. No, it's not. But it fits. It's close enough. It works. And so, like, you're 100% right. That debt, much like money itself, is a tool, but it's a relatively complicated tool. And one of the problems with it, right, which is something that this doesn't mean you should not have debt, but it means that you should kind of approach debt, shall we say, soberly, which is that when you have debt, you're owned, right? You have to. Basically, you are at the beck and call of the broader system to a greater or lesser degree, right? Like, I first one to admit that a home loan is much better than credit card debt. But I think that it's something to, again, kind of consider as a dissident, right? That if you want to decrease your, reliance on the system, that if you have debts, and again, right, it's a tool, sometimes it's a necessary evil, that is a way in which you're controlled. And the difficult thing, right, is that is something that is a tool that, kind of like the system is sort of aware of, right? Which is that it's kind of, I'm of the opinion that the student debt crisis, quote unquote, will never be solved simply because it's entirely too useful to ever be solved.
To your last point, before I forget, on the difference, I do agree 100% with what you had said, that most people are probably not, first of all, smart enough to have debt, and also to exist in the ecosystem where there's so much predatory debt. But I was interested in the student debt crisis specifically, and maybe that falls under both predatory debt and also very, very intelligent debt if used properly. So I'm just wondering if you would expand on it being so important that it might never go away or never be resolved, and resolved both, practically, but also legislatively. Like, there'll never be student debt forgiveness in the future. You don't think?
So there might be some. I'll put it this way: Republicans are too stupid to wield student debt as a weapon, because the natural play, right, is that it's a good way to put two Democratic client groups up against each other, which is, we know, right, according to census data, that if you go to university, you're dramatically more likely to vote blue. And again, I'm not a big Republican Party guy. I just mean to say, right, like, That is the party of power in the US. The other group, right, involved that is dramatically blue, very much a blue client group, is university professors and university workers, right? The head of the anthropology department, I guarantee you at literally every single university in both the US and Canada is a raging leftoid. Like, I guarantee you that. And so what I mean that it's useful, right, is that it's a way to basically keep people tied into, the system, right? That loans allow people like you and I to inject more cash into the patronage network that is higher education at a vastly higher rate than we could on our own. Like if I had to pay, I guess I kind of did pay my way through college, but if I had to 100% fund myself through college, right, there's only a certain amount I could afford, right? Just like, it's why we always say, like, oh, of course you could, get a part-time job in the 60s and pay your way through Columbia, right? Because it just didn't cost very much. But the ability to get loans, right? Now all of a sudden, like, it's a way easier to get a loan for $120,000, right, than it is to cough up 120 grand. And so that's enabled a massive growth of higher education, right? And these are essentially democratic client jobs. LSU is a great example, right? Like, LSU is kind of infamous for graft. And they use all of this money, both directly in the form of grants, effectively subsidies from the federal government, and in these like overblown tuitions paid by student loans to fund a lazy river, right? Like a moving man-made river in the shape of the LSU logo, because they had so much cash sitting around. Okay, so that's one side of it, right? Which is direct patronage. The other one is that it's an incredible way to basically lead people around by the nose, right? Because what Biden said he was going to do, right, which is take 10 grand off of every federal student loan. One, that's a really great way. It's a really great way to make a lot of people, like, it's classic politics, right? It's bread and circuses. Make a lot of people your guys. Even though it didn't go through, I know a lot of people who voted for Biden because of it. And then on the other end, right, the way that federal student loans are set up in the US is that you have automatic forgiveness. Essentially, if you make payments in the private system, like if you work for, like, let's just say like Jiffy Lube or Subway, you wouldn't with a college degree, some company like that, right? As long as you're making payments adjusted to your income for 25 years, I believe it's 25, it might be longer, it's forgiven. You're done, even if you've only paid half of it. But the really interesting thing is, if you work in either the government or a nonprofit, right? So an NGO or a hospital or something like that, it's only 10 years. So what that does, right, is that basically you get to pay your clients on the front end, right, which is university professors, admin, people who work in these like godforsaken, social justice departments. They get paid, of course, on the front end. And on the back end, right, the people who specifically go to work back in your system, right, NGOs, government workers, you get to reward them again.
Now, in your opinion, was it set up with that? Like, how explicit do you think it was set up to benefit that? And also, would you say that most of the people who are working in these areas would be aware of that as well? Like, they kind of get the grift.
That's an interesting question, right? That genuinely is an interesting question.
I know it's a big question. Maybe there's no answer to it, but that was where my mind was wandering.
So, and it's hard to say, right? Like the NRX bro inside of me, basically says like, oh, well, of course, like, people react to incentives. And if you set up a system like this, people are just going to act. You could say it's like naturally occurring. I'll be honest, but then I look at things like what Biden did, and I'm like, that's hardball politics, right? That is someone, probably not, Joseph Biden, making a hard, rational decision to essentially like put politics into motion. So I think, like anything else, is probably a mix of A and B. I'm not the biggest like down the rabbit hole, conspiracy theorist kind of guy. It's just not my wheelhouse, but I could be convinced. If someone wants to send me a schizoid email, I'd read about half of it and then make fun of it on Telegram.
Another example of that might be more to the just a naturally occurring phenomena was I hope this is true. Otherwise, I might be making a fool of myself. But I had heard that it might have been Florida. But in Florida, they said, if you get a woman pregnant, you have to pay child support until they turn 18. But there's a rule where if you have like 8 kids or more, you just don't have to pay child support on any of them ever. So that almost
That's a hell of an incentive.
it incentivizes you to get as many women as pregnant as possible, like as quick as possible. And then I saw that, I'm like, oh my God, that's what DMX was doing. And like,
Dimes, that brings up an interesting question, right? You always have these kind of like, Con Inc. types, who are like, oh, look at Hungary. They increase their population through tax credits. No. We're going to have just like the horde of bastards. It's like every no good, like deadbeat dad's going to have 8 children, no child support. And we'll send all those kids to Taiwan, like just mob the beach with them.
That's actually a fantastic point that I never really considered before, but I've always argued people would say, oh, we need to incentivize childbirth. And throughout history, there have been instances where they tried to fight declining birth rates with an economic solution, and it almost never works. And so I'd always say like, oh, they tried that in Rome, it didn't work. Usually it seems to come from some spiritual, a place of spirituality at least, but that's another angle. And I'm like, imagine just, all the green tech subsidies, but applied to childbirth. Because a lot of people will just like rip off green tech. They'll just like building sky windmills is a scam. They don't do anything, but you get like 25K a year from the government if you have one on your property. Little things like that, where just a bunch of like scoundrels get in on it. So it's like, yeah, this will be. You're only gonna. Everyone's like, oh, you have to increase the birth rate, otherwise it's going to be idiocracy. I'm like, what if you supercharge idiocracy?
Yeah, what if you lean into it? It's like, well, it doesn't matter. We have more retards than you.
Yeah. And honestly, there's some people that are seeing that would unironically be like, yeah, it's good. I like that. More of that. I'm like, all accelerationism in every direction.
So is that what Matt Iglesias meant with 1 billion Americans? 1 billion Americans, IQ 85.
Yeah, you can fit more people if they have smaller IQs. They get people have literally pinheads. Think of how many people you could. But also with the school thing, there was always a metaphor I kept coming back to about. Because a lot of people on our scene are anti-academia, and I understand why, and I side with them. And I went to a college in Canada, and in Canada, college is sort of like a state school. The good ones are just called universities. It's probably I know in America sometimes nice universities are also called colleges, but here colleges are like mid-tier. But the way I looked at it, it's like whenever I give someone advice, I don't like to give advice in the abstract. I give advice to someone as if I am really invested in their future. And if I'm speaking to like a young man asking if they should go to school, I'm like, I know ideologically I should say you shouldn't because it's woke and all shit. But I'm like, am I actually setting you up for failure by saying you should you should go get a scythe and start cutting down wheat because that's what the memes tell you to do. But I'm like, really? But if I am invested in your success, would I say maybe you should go to school for something? And the example I gave was a car. So if someone wants to get a car, the only way they can get a vehicle is to get a car payment. It's a car mortgage, and you're paying that off for how many years? And it's like, yeah, I could say, you know what, fuck that. Don't get into that. You just take the bus. Take the good, honest bus. I'm like, that might be, it's cheaper and it's arguably more ideologically aligned. You're not in paying money to a company that might be investing in some woke stuff. I'm like, you know what? Would I be setting you up for success if I said you should get a car? Like, would your life be, can you get to more job interviews? Can you have more sovereignty with the car? Can you do more stuff with the car that would in the long term make your life better? So for me, it's more difficult to tell young men to just take the bus. It's easy to tell guys like, no, get into a trade. And Judas, you can call bullshit on me on this, but I know like telling a lot of young guys to get into trades, there's a lot of shitty trades. There's a lot of like sorrow in going, unless you do it right, unless you pick the right thing.
Yeah.
No, am I right? Am I way off on that?
I know. I agree with what you're saying, but I mean, I'm going to just agree. But there's a lot of caveats, but I'll agree.
That's as good as I get with him sometimes.
And that's kind of why that I've been perhaps like frustratingly vague in this conversation, right? Because on one hand, right, like I've been probably cooler on trades than some people. And that's just because, like, look, like I've worked a trade job, and I made good money. I didn't make great money, and I got tinnitus, and then I went back to school, you know? Uh, but on the other hand, right, like what you've seen, right, is a lot of these like word cell jobs, like just like writing ad copy. Well, those are going away, and so like I have someone in my personal life who is quite literally quitting a college job where his writing job has been taken over by AI, and now he's an electrician's apprentice. So like this is kind of a fluid situation, and I think that it's the reason I've been kind of cool on the trades, right, is that it is a difficult thing to do. It is genuinely not for everyone. And so like you're kind of right about the advice is that it's like it's so specific, it's so particular to you that other than broad principles, right, which is that like have something bigger than yourself to devote your economic output to, have a mind for the future, don't just put all of your money and effort into a system that hates you, right? Those are broad principles that can apply to anyone. It's kind of like, well, I don't know you, like a lot of my specific knowledge, right, is like US tax law and like US securities regulation. It's like, okay, like that's narrowly useful, but like that doesn't apply to you guys. That doesn't apply to the 20% of my audience from Sweden, right? Like it other than like broad principles, right? It's so unique, it's almost impossible to tell someone.
I got a question for you. And again, this will be a very broad question, and you can tell me to fuck off. But let's imagine a young, dissident minded guy, let's say early 20s, approaches you and says, I'm concerned about the future. I'm not in school, but I'm willing to go into school. And, I want to make shit. What should I do? What should I aspire to do for the next 20 years if I want to do exactly what we're talking about, which is I want to set my family is trash. It's a bunch of hoes over here, and I want to maybe start a new thing. Where should I start? What would you recommend them to do? Again, very broad question, but
So the first thing, right, and this is much easier said than done, but is essentially like find a group of shall we say like roughly like-minded people. For many people, right, this will be a religious group, right? Like I'm involved with some projects on kind of like the online, right, to bring that into the real world, right? Rather through its like Black Horse, I'm a member of the Beowulf Foundation for very much that reason. We're essentially like find a group of people, right? Ideally, that would be family. I realize that's not the situation everyone's in. Let's just say, church or religious group. Okay, you found a group. And then, so, okay, like within that, right, it's like, well, you need to do something like generally, kind of like useful to that. So one of the things, and I really have made a lot of, online hay on essentially like dumping on Rod Dreher, right? Because he's essentially turned himself into kind of a conservative lolcow. But I will say his book, The Benedict Option, is actually quite good on this because he comes from the premise, right, that conservative religious people are a minority. They are no longer the dominant force in politics and culture. And so you essentially need to start playing like you're a minority. And I think that's an attitude that, we need to have, right? That just by virtue of having, kind of extreme opinions, sorry, there's a Honda next door.
I was about to say, I hear a
to
Honda outside.
Yep. Yeah, I'm a block down from, one of the two dive bars in my tiny little town. So it attracts an interesting crowd. The point is, right? So you need to basically like start acting how, minorities act, right? And there's a number of kind of like small, shall we say like ethnic or religious or cultural groups who even though they've been kind of like displaced from their country of origin have been able to kind of keep their identities. And how do they do that? Right. Well, one, it's by kind of like sticking together, right? Which is again, like finding that group, cleaving to it. And then two, right? Like within that group, your interest is sort of sublimated to that of the groups. And so like, for instance, right, in my own life, right, like I'm lucky to live in a kind of a conservative religious community. Like I could have gone to XYZ big city, gotten XYZ big job and made probably more money. But it's like, okay, like go to where your community is, and find something useful to do, And so I was lucky to find a job in industry, But again, right, it's kind of that like finding some kind of something to give yourself to. And I guess like maybe the broad line through all of this, and I'm a somewhat disorganized thinker, so forgive me, but is that essentially, right, like the well-trod path in both, like personal finance and kind of like culture more broadly, is to maximize, your own enjoyment, to maximize your kind of personal utility. And I think we've all seen that that's kind of toxic. And so essentially my advice for this hypothetical person is essentially like find something bigger than yourself to give yourself to. Find a community of roughly, and I'll take that very broadly, roughly like-minded individuals, and essentially start making sacrifices to become part of that group. Because sorry.
I was going to say something occurred to me as you're saying that, and I was going to mention this earlier and I forgot. But one of the pressures placed on people, many of the listeners of the show, and probably your show as well, to accomplish what we're talking about accomplishing, you need to think like 3 generations in the future. You mentioned this right at the start, which is I'm setting up something not for, maybe I'm not going to be the winner of the lottery, but it might be my grandchildren. And I need to think that far ahead to set them up for success. And maybe that was where certain generations went wrong, or at least maybe took their eyes off the prize. But it occurs to me that we often think that it's our ancestors who thought like this. Maybe they didn't. I think it was actually pretty rare that our ancestors, going back so many generations, thought 4 or 5 generations ahead. So I want to just make note that for many of the young people, or kind of 30-year-old boomers like us, that the one thing that we're trying to start is be a generation that thinks 4 or 5 generations ahead, and that's not a normal thing. I don't think a lot of our ancestors did. I think that's an interesting problem we've given ourselves.
Well, and I think that thinking ahead was sort of outsourced to cultural memes, right? That it essentially, and the meme of the prodigal son, right, is actually a pretty useful one, because buried inside that, right, obviously, like I said before, is the kind of like spiritual meaning. But there's also the cultural idea that like, oh, you'll be a bad and shameful person if you do that. And so kind of people reacting again to incentives react to social incentives. So to be honest, right, like I think we all agree, the vast majority of people who would consider themselves anti-racist have never read Ibram X. Kendi, have never really thought about what they're saying. But it's just like, that's what good people do, right? And so I think that what we're sort of in the position of doing, right, is kind of being forced to think about things that were kind of commonly accepted wisdom, right? Common sense, kind of like the normal mean of society, 4 or 5 generations ago. And so that's kind of uncomfortable, right? It's not an easy process. And I think that's where a lot of the like weird kind of like embarrassing LARPy stuff comes from, as people kind of trying to re-engineer civilization.
And to me, that's the exciting part. Some people scoff at that, but one line I was thinking about today, we all joke about the West has fallen. The West has fallen. We even joked about it on this episode. It's kind of become a meme, and we got the what was it, the Chud Jack, the guy complaining the West has fallen at everything. But it occurred to me, I'm like, the West has fallen for us, whether or not it actually has fallen. So in this scene we call the dissident right, we are thinking and behaving as if the West has fallen. So the people who are quote unquote LARPing, no, they're just acting as if the West has fallen. Like, what do? You become a farmer? Do you start? The people who are actually breaking down, like retreating and figure out, like, okay, what the fuck is? Let's figure out where it went wrong. Let's go back. But to do that, you gotta go back 600 years. So a lot of people think that's wasting time, but I'm like, no, that's something we probably should have been doing in the early 2000s, and we weren't. Some people were, but most people weren't. There's a lot of people doing that right now. The idea that we have a pseudo political / philosophical / political science movement that's trying to like get its fingers in the soil of such fundamental stuff. It's people doing it for free, for fun. that's wild to me, and that's exciting. But it's like but we're behaving as if the West is falling and trying to figure out where it went wrong and actually trying to think. And we're just a bunch of guys doing this. We're nobodies. We work, we fucking shuck coal or whatever it is. But we're like, okay, how would you start a civilization? And women make fun of us. We're like, well, but what else? There's nothing else to talk about. There's literally nothing else to talk about than what civilization would you start, and it's fun to do that. But I do think that's an interesting thing to think about just as a guy. And it's people will make fun of you for kind of taking that on your shoulders, but I'm like, why not? Why the fuck not? Why not talk about this stuff? Why not think about starting a village? Because here's the thing, you can probably do it easier now than you could in the past. Or maybe I'm reaching with that, but or maybe it's just as easy as it used to be. But you can do a lot of stuff now if you want to, and you're not crazy for talking about doing it.
Well, and that actually brings up kind of the genuinely like kind of hopeful thing about the situation we're in. So like I'm one to like I enjoy kind of like making using that joke, right, that meme, the West has fallen, like it's funny, right? But Conscious Caracal, right, who's a guy from South Africa, and he's quite an interesting figure. He's South Africa's kind of they're on the other side of the cliff. They're a little bit ahead
What's
of
this
us.
guy's name? Just so I can, if people can look him up.
Yeah, he writes under Conscious Caracal. His real name is Ernst van Zeel or Zale. It's Afrikaans, so good luck spelling that. It's a godforsaken language. But point is, he's a really interesting guy, and he talks about South Africa, right, which is this country that's falling apart. The power works very rarely. There's no clean water. And he's like, look, like on one hand, right, that's scary. That's bad. You wouldn't want to live there if you had the choice. But he's like, on the other hand, that's adventure. That's where the opportunity is, because in the kind of like safety of a well-functioning society, you're kind of hemmed in. There's no chance to kind of make yourself into something great. And I think that that's kind of like the encouraging call within this kind of like quagmire we're in. That like on one hand, right, yeah, like sure, the West has fallen, but it's like, okay, like that's a good time to be an interesting person.
You
That's a
have
good
much
time to
more
kind of make something.
opportunity to be a great man now than maybe even your father or your grandfather did for that reason. I wanted to bring up, actually, because you were talking about the idea that our mores and our principles were different back then, and that's one of the things that kept us in line. But especially if looking at the South African example and then comparing that to our own ancestors maybe 100 or 150 years ago, a lot of those behaviors, even for social pariahs, were incidental because there weren't huge urbanities, or they were at a distance, or you couldn't reach them, and you needed to depend on family and community and the church. Even if you didn't like them, you needed to incidentally depend on them in order to succeed. So people didn't even have to make a moral decision about whether or not they were going to depend on your family. If you didn't depend on your family, you would die. So so you got these great heroes, or like great men who defended their family and built the family home and hunted an elk and did all of this shit. And to them, maybe they were doing it for principle, or maybe they were just doing it because it was the only option. And over the past 50, 60 years, that wasn't the only option. And not only did our morals change, but there are new paths of least resistance that make it easier. And then now, like you said, South Africa is on the other side of the hill, where it is no longer the easiest option to just move to Johannesburg and get a marketing job. Like, you're going to get raped if you do that. So it makes more sense to go out in the countryside. It's actually safer to go out in the countryside and just try to grow maize.
I like that. I like, because that, I think, is the missing piece from that thing I was saying earlier that a lot of people probably disagreed with, but which is like, the value of, in some way, checking out of the system of like it may be that there is an enticement to this. And I think a lot of people in our scene see it, like they want to check out of the system. They want to effectively keep themselves safe. It's not because they want to go on vacation. It's like the idea of wanting to live like Ted Kaczynski because it feels safer than where you are right now is a wild thing to think, but it's a very real thing. And I think that's something we have to incorporate that desire too, because it's real.
And
it's a survival thing.
And we bring up Ted K so often, but he's such a dead end because he was a antisocial, childless loner. And the only thing that there's a lot of things that you can say about him that were, he's quite clever and he figured a lot of things out about how our society works. But we don't need Ted Kaczynski. We need towns and villages. Like, we don't need isolation. We actually need connection and community and fraternity. And the irony is that's what's missing in the urbanities that we have right now. So
Jay, I know we have to get going soon, actually, but I wanted to end with maybe a couple of questions. One was from a financial perspective, just the point we were making, and your earlier thing. Are there more opportunities if we're looking for capital, if we're looking for investment, and we're trying to get a thing going? Does it make sense for each individual to kind of figure out their finances on their own, or is there value of like linking up with like-minded people and kind of going in on financial projects of like taking out loans for to start maybe a village or a town or something? Or is this something like, you should have your own financial sovereignty figured out first before you start approaching projects like that?
So that's an interesting question, right? Because the safe answer is no. Do not meet up with strangers and commit to large financial ventures, right? And that's probably still technically the right answer. But I will say that, and we've kind of mentioned this idea several times, that we are living in kind of unprecedented times. This is not a normal situation, and so kind of the normal rules don't necessarily apply as cleanly, right? And so Charlemagne is a great example, right? On one hand, what he did is kind of a tremendous risk, right? Like he did it. He jumped in with both feet. But to be honest, right, it's like you're going to have to make, again, and this is going back to that idea of making sacrifices, like you're going to have to make some uncomfortable decisions. Now, the scope of those, I would argue, is up to you. I do not want to be held accountable for you selling all your possessions to move to a fishing village in Siberia. I hope it goes well, of course. But there is definitely something to be said for the fact that, like, okay, like if you believe the things that you say online, if you truly believe that like this place is a ticking time bomb, it's bad for you, then like if that's more than just like a entertaining like online pastime, you are going to order your life differently. And some of that may involve, shall we say, like unconventional financial decisions. I'll put it like that.
Yeah. And just, I probably should have opened with this because this is something that's guided some of my thinking recently. But, and I think this is distinct to Canada as opposed to America. Because in Canada, the idea of ownership doesn't really exist like it does in America. And Judas, you and I have talked about this before about how, it might be the same in the US, but I know in Canada, you don't really, if you buy land, you don't own land. You just lease it from the crown. You lease it from the government. So there's always this idea that even if you were to buy property and build an estate or something, at the drop of a hat, the government could take it. You're just leasing it anyway. So there's this idea, like we're always searching for permanence. As we talk about this, about cross-generational projects, we're hunting for this idea of permanence. And maybe in some countries it does exist and they have better private property laws than they do in Canada. But, I think if you're a Canadian, you're dialed into what the law actually says, what the Charter of Rights and Freedoms actually says. You're aware of how precarious everything is. Like you could lose your guns at any second. Really, we're right almost there. But it's like you have to think abstractly. You have to think laterally about, okay, the things I think I can't own, but where else do I find that permanence? Where else do I find it? Maybe that is in community. Like, how do I strengthen the community where it can exist if not tied to a geographic area? Because that geographic area can be yanked out from under me at the moment's notice. I was talking to the Woodlander about it because the Woodlander, he was saying that, if you just set up property and you have a dwelling on there for 5 years, it just becomes your property. And that's how he did it. He kind of just built his thing, hoped no one saw him do it, and he got away with it. And I'm like, I looked into it. I'm like, I don't think that exists in Canada. I think that we weren't grandfathered into that. That's like a cool old British law that Canada doesn't get. So it's like, okay, we don't have the same sort of permanence that other countries have. So how do we create our own? Anyway, that's sort of a meandering thought, but yeah.
No, I mean that's definitely one of the main questions we're all kind of spitballing at,
And I
right?
guess it was, how do we do that financially? And that's kind of where the reason I like to talk to you. It's like, okay, even if we understand that money isn't just gold you stockpile, money, cash is capital, it's transactional. Like the more you hold it, you could lose it the next day. The bottom could fall out financially, and then the thing you thought you had, you don't have. So how do you turn that money into something more permanent? How do you turn that into power? How do you turn that into sovereignty if you can't hold on to anything? And I think that's why I think it's so important to talk to people like you about how can we use money to actually get what we want, and ask yourself, what do you actually want? Do you want just a castle, that you build and shut yourself off from the world? Or do you want something maybe a bit more ethereal, but something that lasts beyond you? Because, the boomer who's like yanking all their money to the bank to invest, they think investing in that shitty fucking motorcycle is like going to outlast them. There's, or that vintage car, that's their version of permanence, in a very
Or
materialist
even,
way.
right, like, and you kind of brought it up, right, that the whole point of saving is to fund, a 30-year vacation at the end of your life, right? Like that's, on one hand, it's a cultural, like, it's a culturally high status thing.
Yeah.
And so again, like, maybe you could probably criticize me for being overly vague in this, but there's something to be said for the fact that, setting, kind of wiring your mind, kind of viewing money as a means to an end, and then setting like specific ends that kind of lead to, a situation in which kind of, your, your ideas, right, kind of make it through, the genetic bottleneck that is modernity, right? That, okay, like if going along to get along, leaves you with, let's just say $1 million in your bank account and no offspring, right? You're effectively a biological failure, but if you can kind of like, I guess like judo turn, whatever economic power you have into kind of like, making sure that you kind of make it through, to adopt kind of one of Black Horse's, kind of like frames, I would argue that's probably a good model for success.
I think that's a good way to bring people back to it. The genetic, but you're trying to survive a genetic bottleneck, and as Omar Little said from The Wire, money doesn't have owners, only spenders. You don't even want to know how long I was sitting on that one. I kept forgetting it and coming back to it. I'm like, I'm gonna reference The Wire to win over my audience. All right, Juice, did you have any thoughts on that? I don't. I might have said a lot of things. I hope I agree with them later. I hope I explain them. I wasn't trying to be too contrarian, but I have been thinking recently about, like, abandoning what could be useful territory for long-term goals. You know what I mean?
Well, I like the focus on the concept of permanence. I think that is a thread that ties a lot of this together, whether we're talking about family and community or a return to religion or other principles, like principles of a community, even if it's not a religious community, or like building a building a business, but like it's not a cell phone case drop shipping business, but like a mill, that generations can work at, or there's a or a house, like a fit, like we talk about the family farm. Like you're putting in time and energy and resources into something with the expectation that your grandchildren will still hold on to it. So I think that that's a huge part of it.
Yeah.
And that, from my perspective, I give guys a hard time all the time because I don't want to be critical, but I just feel like so much of what we do is so focused on politics and narrative and all of this, and it's like our guys need land and our guys need jobs and they need wives, and those, like, jobs, land, and wives are the only things to me that actually matter. And that, if we want to put a point on the question, it's how do we get jobs, land, wives, and friends, and like how do we build churches, how do we build roads, like, and I mean, I'm talking not metaphorically but like literally, how
Yeah.
do we do that?
No, and I just
Because
want
we don't have that. Like when I look out my window, and again, I'm not speaking metaphorically. I look out my window and I'm at work and I'm looking at the guys' families. Like I'm looking at this 67-year-old guy who should have retired 3 years ago, but he's making $18 an hour and his wife has cancer. Why is he here? Like, where is his family? Why does he rent? Why he's 67? Why doesn't he own a house? Why does he drive a shitbox Acura? And like, where are his children? You know, that there's real, like, that's a thing. It's not something to solve.
Let me
So
just say, he said Acura because he knows I drive an Acura, and he was trying to twist. He's trying to twist the knife. You know what you did. You hoped you could slip that by. No, but you raise a very good point there, because this is something, and we can probably end on this, but this is something we talk about all the time on the show, because in our scene, it's very easy to speak in very highfalutin terms. You'll hear the terms, vague terms like community. You'll hear people say, like, we need religion, spirituality, and then maybe it's us being, well, you might say a grud brain. But I demand, like, what does that mean? What do you mean? We need spirituality. What do you mean? Does that mean start a church? Do we need? Would that help it? And one of a lot of the investigations we do on the show is really trying to pull on the threads of, okay, what do you actually, when we say, oh, the West needs spirituality? Okay, what happened there? Let's go back in time. What were the spiritual movements? What's the relationship between Catholicism and Protestantism? All that, historical stuff we do is to trace these threads of figuring out where society started, where it went wrong, but also saying, like, okay, if you want to get back to something, what do you need to do? Do you need to buy some land? Do you need to start a church? Do you need to start a business? Like, tell me the 5-step plan to make this better. And that is something that's very lacking in this scene. Like, give me a fucking 20-year plan, because we got guys who can do it, but a lot of people, they don't even know how to approach that. They can only speak in sort of bird's eye view, complicated terms. But that, to me, isn't even that interesting. And I think that poses as a distraction for a lot of people. Anyway, that's my feeling. Anyway, like, if you can't prescribe even a blue sky plan on, like, how to, like, if everything goes right, here's 5 things you could do to maybe make society better. A lot of people don't even have that. If they had $1 billion, they wouldn't know how to spend it, right? Anyway, I'm just rambling now.
Well, thanks for having me on, guys. I hope I was a satisfactory guest.
oh, I appreciate it, man. It was really good.
It was really good. We'll have you back on again too, because I really enjoyed this. We're just having fun. It
Yeah, definitely. I feel like I could read the phone book with you guys. Yeah.
All right, and just to let people know, go listen to the Jay Burden Show. It's a wonderful suite of interviews. Some of the best people in our scene. You can find them on Twitter @_ Jay Burden, and find them on Substack. Go there right now and check them out, and drop them a line. And thank you again for taking the time to sit down.
Yep, sure thing.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.